Welcome to the Ben Wood Johnson podcast. You can visit Dr. Johnson's blog at benwoodpost.com. Dr. Johnson's works can be found at drbenwoodjohnson.com. You can also support Dr. Johnson on Patreon, the link to which is in the description. Hey everybody, welcome to the Ben Wood Johnson podcast. Today is April 20th, 2020. This is podcast number 47. Before I begin, let me take this opportunity to send my condolences to all the individuals who have passed on as a result of the COVID-19. I want to send my support to their families. This is a difficult time for you, I know. The COVID-19 is this unexpected burden that the life throws at you on top of everything else. So I get it. This is a difficult time. But let us stay strong. Let us stay united. Let's not give up on this fight. Let's keep fighting. We are almost there. So let's honor the memories of those who have fallen so far. So again, the coronavirus is not over yet. We still have a long way to go. So let's keep up the fight and we're going to be victorious in the end. Anyway, the podcast today is about survival. We've talked about survival in so many podcasts. Today we're going to sort of delve into the meaning of this concept. It is a very difficult term. It's a very, it's not that difficult to the extent that, you have to approach the concept from an individual standpoint. And this is what I am going to do in this podcast. So without further ado, let us delve right into it. Striving to survive. I think within the context of what's happening in the world today, when you hear the term survival, many things come to mind. In this context, when we're talking about survival, when we're talking about striving to survive, what's important to take into account, or what's important to consider, is whether the being has the means to survive. Now, in several podcasts, I have talked about the notion of survival, but I've not talked about it directly. For instance, when I talk about technology, when I talk about individualism, when I talk about collectivism, when I talk about Jean-Paul Sartre, the concept of existentialism, when I talk about phenomenology, ethics, all these concepts we debated in previous podcasts, what I am hinting at is the notion of survival. The concept of survival is important because you could not examine, study, explore the being without understanding his capacity to survive. And by that I mean to understand the being at his core. You have to examine or to understand the extent to which the being is able to survive. Now, this brings us to an interesting question, and that is, what is survival? How do you define survival? The term survival could be understood from different or several angles. You could look at the term from a societal lens. In other words, you could look at it from a sociological standpoint. In other words, the individual lives in a society where there are certain mechanisms in place in that environment which allows the being to survive. We could look at the term from a biological standpoint. In other words, the being has certain natural proclivities or tendencies or strength or certain underlying biological features in the being that allows him to survive, whether the being is resistant, whether the being is resilient to certain elements, certain things within the natural, which provides the being an edge to survive within the natural. But we could also look at the concept from a philosophical standpoint. In this case, we have to look at survival within the perspective of how the being perceives the self in relation to others within a particular environment. And I think this approach is much more important than the other approaches, because even though the being might be in a society where there might exist certain entities which would allow the being to survive. For instance, there might be a government that takes care of its people. There might be institutions that provide for the individual or the collective. Okay? There might be mechanisms of social mobility where the individual can go from one place within the social strata into another. Okay? Or if we were to look at it from a biological standpoint, the being might be strong internally or externally. The being might have an immune system that allows him to resist the natural to the extent that most cannot or could not. But when the being is able to perceive the self in relation to others, that provides the being an edge. Because now the being could step aside from the self to the extent that the being could examine the self introspectively in relation to others. The concept of survival is the foundation of humanity. Of course, survival is not germane to human beings only. Okay? Every living entity must survive. Every living and breathing entity on the planet must survive. They must go on. But in certain milieu, in certain environments, survival is a gimmick. The reason it is a gimmick, it is because there's an expectation that the being would be able to survive. Not only others expect the being to survive, the being expects himself to survive as well. And those expectations often are contrary to the reality the being faces. For instance, in a particular social milieu, there might be conditions, there might be reality, which makes it impossible for a person to survive. Now, if we are looking at the term survival from a natural standpoint, if we were to step back and look at the concept from a natural standpoint, we would say that survival within the natural is not a challenge. It is not easy, of course, but it is definitely possible. If we were to go back to the Dark Ages, if we were to go back to the instances where man lived off the land to the extent that man had to cultivate the land in order to survive, man had to hunt in order to survive, most men survived. And they were able to do so to the extent that survival was possible. And by that I mean, if there are food available for the man to eat, the man will survive. If the man is able to hunt, the man will survive. So survival from a natural standpoint is not such an impossible thing. It is not such a challenging thing where the being has to sort of like hope to survive. Because the natural provides for the being. Everything the being needs to survive is within reach. The being only has to reach for it. And one of my previous podcasts, particularly the beginning, the first podcast, where I talk about the notion of technology, where the being has a certain know-how which is intrinsic to the being in order to survive. Technology as we sort of understand it today It's not the notion that one goes somewhere to learn to be. Technology is sort of a part of the being. Every human being, every being is a technician, to the extent that every being could come up with technologies or techniques or savoir-faire to survive. Because these techniques, this savoir-faire or these understandings, so to speak, are within the natural. Every being possesses the capacity to survive. Survival is not a gimmick, to the extent that the being is not restrained. So within the natural, every being has the means to survive, because survival within the natural is not a gimmick. It is there. It is not a farce. It is not a make-believe. It is not something that one has to acquire. It is not something one has to sort of go somewhere to get. It is not something one has to sort of have a certain credential to get. In other words, survival in the natural is natural. It's intrinsic. Every being that is capable of survival will survive within the natural. And there is no way around that. Survival in the social milieu, on the other hand, is a gimmick. There is the illusion of survival. There's the understanding that the being can survive, right? All the being has to do is to sort of like do this, that, or that. In this case, for instance, the being has to go to school, have a diploma. The being has to have a job, you know? The being has to work hard, and only then the being will survive. As it turns out, even that is not enough sometimes. As it turns out, that is not enough, because sometimes, even though the being may have a job, even though the being may have an education, even though the being may have the means, at least what was required for him to survive, survival would still be denied to that being. That being would still not be able to survive, because the foundation of survival is not intrinsic. The foundation of survival in the social milieu is not a given. It is capricious. It is a gimmick. It is a make-believe. And oftentimes, the being finds himself in this dilemma, where his nature tells him that you are supposed to survive. But the reality often depicts a different reality, a different picture, where the being is like, oh, I just can't survive, because in order for me to survive, I have to do this. But even if I did this, I still cannot survive. And that reality sometimes creates conflict in the being, where the being sort of wonders, the being sort of escapes the self, at least try to escape his reality, because the being cannot deal with this reality of not being able to survive when his instincts are telling him that he must survive. Now we have to understand that the concept of survival has different connotations, to the extent that, you know, the concept could be sort of looked at from a political standpoint, you know. So in other words, one lives in a society where there are certain entities that are there to support the being. All the being he needs to do to survive is to be on the right side of that political frame of mind. In other words, the being sort of supports this government or support that government. That's all the being has to do in order to survive. And once you are a part of this group, or once you are a part of that group, you are going to survive. Of course, again, going back to this concept of gimmick, because at the end of the day, even though you did that, you might still not be able to survive. But there's also the concept that if you are of a certain skin tone, like if you happen to be of this color or of that color, your survival is guaranteed. At the same time, if you happen to be of that color, your survival might be a little bit tricky. But even then, you might find out that having the color that is necessary in order to survive, your survival might still be difficult, if not impossible at times. Then the question becomes, what is survival then? What is necessary for a person to survive? And when the person is faced with this dilemma, where he knows he must survive, he feels it within his soul that he has to survive, but the conditions are not met for him to do so. What can the being do in such a situation? Now, I do not have the answer to the extent that I could not speak for others. As I've always tried to do in this podcast, I've always tried to sort of share my own understanding of the reality of people. Now, that understanding is not political in nature, because I'm not a politician, to put it this way. I am a philosopher. To the extent that I'm able to think, I philosophize. In other words, cogito ergo philosophus. Or if I philosophize, therefore I am a philosopher. If I can think, then I philosophize. And if I philosophize, by extension, I am a philosopher. As I've tried to do in my podcast is to share these personal insights, okay, as to what the being is to do. Because you have to understand that philosophy, at least the way it is understood in society these days, is somewhat, different from what philosophy used to be, okay? When I was a kid, I used to read philosophy. I used to read about philosophers, what led people to philosophize, and some of them became great philosophers, became famous. But originally, what led a person to philosophize, or at least to become a philosopher, was this idea of questioning the world within, questioning the world around. So that's what I'm trying to do. I am trying to sort of share my understanding of the world that I'm experiencing every day. And I'll be honest with you, it is not a wonderful world. I'll be honest with you, I am not living the most wonderful lives you could imagine right now. In fact, I am in hell. I am living in hell. As a young man, I am living in hell. Just turned 45. I am not certain that I'm going to be 50. And if I were to be 50, I'm not certain I'm going to be 55. Because I am living in this hell environment where every day, for me, is the last. My survival is not guaranteed. I am living by chance. Now, as it turns out, I'm not the only one. I could lie to myself. I could escape my reality. I could pretend that I am living well. I could pretend that I am surviving when I know I am dying inside. But the reality is that I have to acknowledge that reality. And if I fail to acknowledge that reality, I could become a victim of that reality, like so many people are. Have you ever wondered why people sometimes engage in conducts that sort of take them to places that they might not have gone otherwise? Have you wondered sometimes? Well, sometimes the answer is not that far-fetched. The answer is not that hard to find. You have to look around and look at the environment where the person is evolving. So many people are living in conditions where their survival is so precarious that sometimes they have to escape that reality. And in escaping that reality, they ended up getting themselves in situations they would have never imagined. Okay? And try to escape that reality. Other times, the person is so carried away by the reality he is living that he becomes a monster inside. He becomes livid with anger, with a desire to destroy things around. Because he is living in such a bestial reality. So he's living like a beast and he becomes the beast. And I think that's why society must play an important role. And again, going back to my podcast here, when we're talking about the notion of collectivity and individuality, where society has an important role to play in the lives of each and every individual. Now, I understand that society itself is not the natural, to the extent that society has a different venue, has a different sort of reality as far as the natural is concerned. Of course, if we were to go into the semantics of the term natural, we could say that society is still within the purview of the natural. And I think I've talked about that in one of my books. I believe it's the book Cogito Ergo Philosophus, nonetheless. But the idea is that society, we have to understand, it's a secluded environment where the individual is sort of forced to evolve within that little parameter where the individual has certain boundaries he has to respect. There are certain rules that the individual has to abide, okay? And the only way the individual is going to be able to function within that boundary is when the individual is given the opportunity to be a certain way, okay? And when the individual is denied those opportunities, the individual could do two things. He could lie to himself, which would take us back to Jean-Paul Sartre. And the concept of the individual could be living in bad faith. Or the individual could take his life too seriously, to the extent that the individual could sort of become consumed by the reality he is facing. And I think both approaches are dangerous, because if the individual were to live in bad faith, the individual would be not only lying to himself, he would be lying to others and making life more precarious for both himself and others, because the reality cannot go away. You could not take away the reality that the being is facing. You could escape it for a moment. You could deny it for a moment. But at the end of the day, that reality is going to come back and haunt you. So living in denial is not an answer. On the other hand, taking your reality too seriously could also be a problem, because here the individual could be so consumed by his reality where he cannot see a way out. He cannot look for ways out, or at least ways to get out, because the individual is so consumed by that reality, he becomes moribund, or he becomes sort of stiff to a point where he cannot move either way. Move forward, move backward, he's so stiff. And when he's able to make a move, he's going to make that move with such a violence that the individual could become a beast for the others. And I think that's where sort of the danger is. There's a need to balance the reality to the extent that the individual understands that sometimes survival is impossible. Recently, I published a book titled Striving to Survive. So in this book, I talk about the impediments a person might face in his journey in life. But in this book, I specifically talk about survival from the concept, from the perspective of an immigrant. Now, I am an immigrant, and I've been living in America for half of my life, more than half of my life, I can say. I left my country back in 1997, went to Mexico. From there, I came to America, and I've been here ever since. Okay. Of course, it wasn't my intention initially. I went to Mexico to study, came to America to study, and there I am, several years later, father, married, stuck here. I have found it hard to survive. And sometimes it's hard for me not to see myself trapped in this world, trapped in this country, trapped in this reality. Unfortunately for me, I've been living this reality. And when I talk about survival, whether I am talking about survival from the perspective of when I'm talking about technology, whether I am talking about the reality of the immigrant. But that reality applies to everybody to the extent that we are all immigrants. Because you see, a lot of people tend to see immigrants as some kind of exogenous entity, an exotic being, like someone who comes from somewhere. We all came from somewhere. And to some extent, we are all immigrants. Yes, some have been in certain places longer than others, but we are all immigrants to the extent that we, at some point in our lives, have had to adjust, have had to adapt, have had to find means to survive. And many of us, at some point in our lives, we have had to sort of follow the rules of the new environment. Abide by the rules of the new environment in order for us to survive. Whether you move from one town to another, you have to adjust, adapt, and survive. And when you get to that environment, you have to assess yourself within that environment to the extent that you have to look around and see the reality that you are experiencing, understanding why you are able to survive if survive you can, and why you cannot survive if survive you cannot. Because to me, I think that's what it is. You cannot lie to yourself, sort of let yourself drift into this world of make-believe. And at the same time, you cannot let yourself consumed by anger. Okay? Because if you are not able to survive in a society where you were supposed to survive, then you could only be in an eternal conflict with yourself. So in this book, I talk about survival from the perspective of an immigrant. So I talk about how sometimes survival is impossible. And when survival is impossible, the being finds itself in a dilemma. What do? I have to survive. I have to eat. I have to feed myself. I have to feed my family. But I cannot do it. What is the conditions I am faced are not suitable for me to do it. I cannot survive. What can the being do? So in this book, I sort of lay out what I think is important for the being to do. Okay? Because sometimes the being finds itself in an environment where survival is just simply impossible for whatever the reason. Okay? And the being has to look around and understand that environment and see the self accordingly. Do not submerge yourself in the reality of the environment to the extent that you forget yourself. You become complicit to this reality, and then you sort of live in this denial and bad faith, as Jean-Paul Sartre would say. Also, do not allow yourself to become consumed by the environment, because the reality of the environment is not necessarily your reality. It is a reality that you find yourself in it, but it is not necessarily your reality to the extent that you do not allow the environment to become you, to define you as a person. But survival in and of itself is the idea that the being has to find a way to carry out or to carry on, to carry out his existence. Now remember, when we're talking about existence, we have to take into account that there are 3 levels before one can exist. The first level is that one has to be. In other words, one has to be there, be born, be made. One has to be physically. Okay? That's the first step in existence. The second step in existence is that one has to maintain that beingness. In other words, one has to subsist. And that's where survival becomes an important aspect, because in maintaining one's beingness, one is able to subsist. And subsist, that's when one survives. Because one is able to maintain one's existence by subsisting. And subsisting sometimes, that's what's impossible, because the being may not be afforded the means to subsist. And by subsist, I mean the being is able to feed the self, take care of the self, take care of the family, either physically or mentally. But the being is able to maintain the self. The being is able to maintain his beingness. And that's what survival, in a sense, means. And sometimes the being finds the self in a situation where that is impossible. The being cannot subsist. The being simply cannot be. Therefore, the being cannot exist. Okay? So in this book, I sort of go back and talk about it from this perspective. So as an immigrant, how hard it is to survive. And why is it important for you to strive to survive? So in this book, I argue that it is important, always important to survive. So no matter what, the being has to find the means to survive. If not, the being has to do anything in his power to maintain his existence. So the being should never allow the self to drift in a situation where the being's unexistence could be extinct, prematurely, of course. So the being has to do everything in his power to maintain his existence. And in doing everything in your power to maintain your existence, that is survival in a nutshell. So I encourage you, wherever you are, whoever you are, wherever you might be at this moment, to maintain your existence. At least to find means to maintain your existence. And in doing so, you would be surviving.